Have a great night. Thank you all for coming. Let's welcome Charles Dowding.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk here. And it's been quite a long drive, but it's been worthwhile already. So what I'm going to explain to you is how I garden in a slightly different way to how you might read about or see elsewhere, including on television. Actually, I'm always amazed how little real information there is on gardening TV programs. But I don't have a TV anymore, so I'm maybe out of date there. But basically, my methods are very simple, and I think they fall foul of the authorities a bit for that reason, because people don't like it if you actually really educate people to do something and empower people with knowledge that they can understand and put into practice. Now, I don't know if you've noticed it in other spheres of activity, but I certainly notice it in gardening all the time, that the so-called experts are actually really expert at complicating things. And you know, people are left in a slight fog, and so they don't really quite understand what they're doing, but they know more or less, and so they have to keep going back to the expert to get more details, and it puts the teachers in a position of power, which is not healthy, I don't think. What I really want to do is actually help people understand what they're doing, and I'm always saying just understand the principles, and then you can work out your own slightly different techniques. Everybody with gardening is just a brilliant example, because nobody has the same situation. Everybody has slightly different soil. Maybe some people are in planters, some people are in the ground, some people have got polytunnel, others haven't. You know, everybody's growing in a slightly different starting point. And they've all got slightly different amount of time available, different microtypes and so on. So you've got to work out the details. Tonight I want to give you the principles, and then you can take it from there. And I'll use examples from my garden to show you and inspire you. So here we have some produce that I grew last summer, and some of it is, you've probably heard about GMOs and hybrid vegetables and things like that. Again, a lot of misinformation about this, but basically hybrid vegetables, F1 hybrids, are okay. They're kind of a slightly unnatural way of breeding, but they're not anything to do with genetic manipulation, which I think is actually horrible, frightening, dangerous, and it should be outlawed immediately. But luckily it doesn't come too much into vegetables, because there's a genetically modified apple now, but nothing in vegetables. So anyway, some of these are hybrids, and I just mention that because, for example, the small cherry orange tomatoes on the right there is a variety called Sun Gold, which I actually warmly recommend to anybody, but it is a hybrid seed, which means that if you kept the seed of those Sun Gold tomatoes, they won't grow true. You won't get Sun Golds. I did try it once, that's how I know for sure. Basically, I sowed some Sun Gold seeds and I got 15 different varieties from 15 different seeds, and none of them tasted nice. So you can only keep your own seeds of tomatoes with old-fashioned, what they're now called heritage varieties. Basically, heritage means, you know, it's been around a while. Doesn't mean it's any good necessarily, but it's quite old. And actually, the big yellow tomatoes on the right, they're yellow brandy one. That's a really nice heritage tomato. Not hybrid. You can keep your own seed. And keeping your own seed is one way of empowering yourself in gardening. Sadly, it's not quite as easy as it's sometimes portrayed. But there's a very good website called realseed.co.uk. You might have heard of them. They're seed growers in Pembrokeshire, and they like to share information as well, so I recommend that if you want to find out more about seed saving. So the next picture shows you a selection of winter vegetables. Those were all harvested or taken out of my store on December the 19th this year. So that's December, that's what you can have in December, just before Christmas. And the green things mostly I just picked fresh. It will certainly help, you probably remember that extraordinary warm December we had last year, so obviously this is a bit exceptional. But it's giving an idea. For 9 months of the year, if you get organised, you can have vegetables to eat. What you can't have is tomatoes for 9 months a year. You know, you have seasonal vegetables. And I can assure you that when you're really committed to that and you go down that road of eating what's in season, you will be amazed. And you will be so impressed and pleased that you've done it, because your palate will experience flavours but you haven't enjoyed it even up till now. When you grow your own food and it's in season, the flavour just leaps out at you. And it's not the same as eating, you know, strawberry at Christmas, that kind of crazy thing. So all of that, because it's fresh or it's been in store, is tasting really nice. So actually, October, November, December are probably peak months for having a bit of everything available, and then it tails off until April and May, and that's the hungry gap when there's not much fresh produce. But in hungry gap time, April, May, you can forage and get things like nettle tops, stinging nettles. Has anybody eaten stinging nettle tops? Oh, yeah, quite a few. Okay, I can see you're a knowledgeable audience. But if you haven't tried that, they're really nice. So, just going on about how I do all that, that's the tools I use, even up to an acre. That's how, in my previous garden I was gardening an acre, and that's all I used, except for I did use a lawnmower and occasionally a chainsaw. But for gardening, that's it, and no engines. I don't obviously use a rotavator or anything like that. With no-dig gardening, you just need a good wheelbarrow actually to move stuff around. And a manure fork, that's not a digging fork, it's a manure fork on the right. And the copper tools, so spade, like that's for planting trees and that kind of thing. Digging out parsnips, actually, lever them out. Copper trowel, copper hoe. Copper because, again, here's an example of something that's been quite willfully suppressed. Copper's a magic tool for cultivating soil, probably not quite the right word, but for any kind of intervention in the soil with a metal tool, copper doesn't disturb the soil energies in the same way as iron does. Copper's not magnetic. And personally, I think we still don't understand why copper's so effective, and so I won't try and explain something I don't know, but all I know is the results are really good, and furthermore, those tools are really nice to use. They've been really well crafted and made to last, so that I'm afraid they're expensive to buy, because they're expensive metal. It's actually, strictly speaking, bronze, 5% tin, 95% copper. Like that hoe, top left, it's very thin blade, slides through the surface compost. It doesn't really go into the soil very easily, so it's effortless to use, I find, and cuts through the weeds when they're very small, so you can weed large areas very quickly and without hurting the soil, organisms or energies. So no dig. Starting with a blank canvas. This was 4 years ago. I separated from my wife, so I left my immaculate garden and moved to a new place, and there we are. That was what it looked like in October after I'd hired a tractor to just top the very rough pasture. So this is pasture full of grass and a lot of weeds, including the buttercup, dandelion, gooch grass, bindweed, usual stuff. How do you turn that into a garden? No dig. Well, basically, my method I used there mainly was putting a lot of compost on top. So this method does depend initially on having quite a bit of compost. If you don't have that much compost, you could use polythene mulches and other options. But that's going from winter then to June the following year without disturbing the soil at all. It was looking like that. So that's from, really I only started there in January, so that's 5 months' work to produce that already abundance. And initially the plants are growing, rooting into the compost, and then their roots travel into the undisturbed soil below. Undisturbed soil has all the openness that you could want. You know, it's become, for some reason, it's just assumed. I think because people are told it all the time, that you've got to dig, you've got to reserve, whatever it might be. They just assume that soil needs man or woman to intervene. And you wouldn't believe the amount of disbelief I get when I, for example, demonstrate that photograph and say the soil has not been touched from what you saw in the previous picture when it was growing grass and weeds. And I was explaining this in some detail to the current head gardener at Sissinghurst Castle in Kent, that's one of the National Trust prime properties. He's a highly trained gardener, one of the best gardeners in Britain, Troy. And after I'd explained all this, and he looked at me and he said, right, he said, let me just get one thing straight. He said, the first thing you did was remove the toes. No, John, I never said that. Where does he get that from? He's just, his brain is hardwired to believe that. And that's the kind of thing one is up against. I think in any kind of activity where you have a new method that really works, but it contravenes the mass opinion. It's a bit like the 100th monkey thing, I think. There's a lot of energy against you. There really is. And I find this with no dig. And You know, I'm demonstrating it all the time, and yet people are still scratching their heads. So ongoing, the garden is looking pretty mulch by this stage. This is a year and a half later now, and that's how it carries on basically. It's very, once you've got rid of the perennial weeds, and I won't go into that in some detail, you've just got a compost mulch on top. I use compost because it doesn't harvest slugs. For me, slugs are the #1 pest. Depends a bit where you are, and is slugs a big problem here?
Yeah.
Right, okay. So that is why compost mulch. And this is where big sources of confusion arise. Some of you, I'm sure, will have come across and dabbled a bit with permaculture. Personally, I probably shouldn't say this because I know I'm being filmed, but I think permaculture is being massively misrepresented in Britain and not well taught mostly, because it's come from Australia originally with Bill Mollison, for example. Techniques that are adapted to a dry, subtropical climate where it appears they don't have slugs. And people are just taking those techniques without really thinking about it. And it goes back to what I was saying, think about what you're doing. You know, why am I doing this? Or why is that person on the video or in this course explaining, or why are they telling me to do this? You know, always ask for an explanation. If someone tells you to do something, ask them why. If they're not explaining it properly, most of the time they probably can't actually. They say, well, he told me to. And PDCs, permaculture design courses, you know, you're allowed to teach them after just training for a weekend yourself. It's crazy. So in permaculture, you're often taught, commonly, to use sheet mulches. But you'll get terrible slugs. I tried it myself in 1983, I know from experience. So compost. Compost is the answer. Compost does not harvest slugs, but it feeds the soil. So that soil, those beds may look bare, but they're mulched with compost. Compost is protecting the soil, feeding the soil, and you get that by the following summer and autumn. Abundance. And it's really easy because you haven't, once you spread your compost mulch, once you've got rid of your perennial weeds, then it's a question of light hoeing of annual weed seeds that germinate, and off you go. Quick to sow, quick to plant, wonderful harvest, and then also at this time of year now, quick to resow and replant. So you can crop much more from a small area. If anyone's starting out and they've got a big plot, I always say, go small and do it well, do it intensive, and you'll be surprised what you can get. And don't, you know, allotments now, I think, need to be scaled down for modern lifestyles. They were designed, they're really big, and they were designed, you know, in wartime, people even kept pigs on them and grew potatoes and cauliflowers and stuff. If you grow small-scale intensive veg, more like that, you'll be amazed what you can get from a small area. Another example of mulching, that's homemakers when I ride front gardens. So one thing I do dig out, where I use my copper spade or trowel, is bramble roots, for example, woody roots. I'm not averse to a bit of initial digging if there's things like that in the way of mulching, if it's woody stuff. And then ongoing October, you can see by foliage like that. Front garden now is beautifully clean. There was even a lot of hedge bindweed there. Almost none of it now, it's nearly all gone. And it's easy to look after them. No dig method, very good for flowers, very good for fruit trees, fruit bushes, everything. You know, it's just a universal principle of not disturbing the soil, leaving its organisms in peace, where they can do their work for us, and we feed the soil, which means feeding them. Compost mulch is all about feeding the soil through feeding its life. That makes it work for us, and there you go. And if you've got a problem like that, what do you do? So that was where Homemakers' first winter, very wet, the builder had been driving his dumper truck on that ground. He was building me a conservatory, and I looked at it, oh God, bloody, and had a little rummage in the soil with my trowel and discovered that it wasn't deeply damaged soil. It was smeared on top by the rubber tyres, about 2 inches. And below that was nice fluffy soil. So I waited for it to dry out in April, evened it out with the spade. Oh, sorry, I think these got anything. Yeah, there is another picture to show them. Basically, I evened it out and scattered grass seed, bit of compost, and it came out the lawn. So, you know, it was really, really easy, saving time. Here is my method that I use to make the beds in Homemakers' front garden. So I'm putting there 6 inches on average of compost, and that is quite a few tons. It's probably 15 tons going on that picture. Might sound a lot,
tonne is actually not very much. You know, if you had a tonne heap of compost and you got stuck in with a wheelbarrow, you've gone before you know it. So don't be daunted when you hear tonne figures. If you're ever buying compost, if you can get hold of green waste municipal compost, always buy more than you think you're going to need. You'll be amazed how much you can get through. And you're using a waste product basically. You know, it's other people's waste going into something useful. A cow, by the way, produces 4 tonnes of manure in the winter. So you know. And then going on, the idea is to both feed the soil and kill the weeds. So the initial mulch is thick, it's for 6 inches, and I'm using cardboard in the pathways to smother the weeds. And when the cardboard wears through, which it does, I put another sheet on top until the couch grass or the bindweed are dead or very nearly dead, and then use a trowel as well to remove anything. So I was 4 months later, and getting a quick result, and that's really helped my propagation if you can do that. If you've got I mean, out of interest in people here, have you got any propagating space, greenhouse? Or put out your hand if you have? Oh yeah, great, quite a few. I mean, if you haven't, that means any undercover space where you've got sufficient light to raise plants, you can gain so much time. You can increase your growing season, you also increase your chances of success, because so many problems happen with tiny little seedlings that, for example, are eaten by slugs, hundreds overnight. Whereas if you raise plants in a more secure environment, it's a bit like raising babies really, and then put them out when they're big enough to look after themselves a bit, they can defend themselves against the problems. Oh, thank you. So here's another problem is couch grass. Some of you will know that. That's one of the most common persistent perennial weeds. Perennial means its roots survive and you've got to starve them until they die. So the compost is doing that partly by light suppression, and I then go along with my trowel to remove the regrowth until the parent root dies underneath. And sometimes you can do that while growing. So for example, on the left there was couch grass in that bed where I covered it with cardboard and then a supposedly biodegradable polythene. It wasn't actually very, but I just planted 3 melons through the holes and got a very nice harvest in August while the couch grass was dying underneath. So sometimes you can crop while you're killing weeds as well. Here it's a bit worse problem of weeds. That's field bindweed. That's a very difficult weed. Field bindweed is the more small leaf one, makes little pink flowers if it gets that far. And the carpet, basically, that's a nice old woolen carpet, by the way. I don't recommend using modern synthetic carpets. They're full of nasty stuff, but if you happen to know someone who has a lovely, really expensive old Axminster wool carpet, they make brilliant mulch. And what I've noticed is the worms love them actually. They disappear in 2 years completely, just get eaten. But while that's happening, it's mulching, and you can see it's killed the pasture, the grass, and most of the weeds, except the bindweed. That's all bindweed that's regrowing there. So that I did remove with the trowel. That was a bit ongoing. That's the method. So using the copper trowel just to lever out a bit of bindweed root. And this is not probably one of the most tedious jobs. Getting rid of the perennial weeds or weakening them massively so that they're not a problem ongoing. But it's worth it. The first year can be difficult if you're taking on really weedy plant. Ongoing, you will reap the benefit. That's my son holding one of these bindweed roots, and it's why you can never get rid of them, because they do go on forever. And then for annual weeds, which is the other kind of weed, which can also seem daunting sometimes, that's what I like, this kind of swivel oscillating hoe. There are many kinds of hoe though, and everyone has their favourite, so this is not the only one, but I find that works really well. Just sliding it through, backwards and forwards, through the surface compost, and catching the weeds that size. Can you see the weeds there? Just. That's the size of weed that you want to be hoeing. This is really important information here, but that doesn't often happen, unfortunately, because maybe you're away for a week or something. But if you catch your weeds small, you can hoe hundreds, thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands very quickly and solve yourself a lot of potential problems. A lot of good gardening is about seeing what is coming ahead and dealing with it before it's a problem. When you get to the point that things aren't a problem, that's when it gets tricky. So it is a lot about skill and knowledge. You know, don't underestimate that. But armed with the information I'm giving you, I very much hope that you can go away if you follow these methods, like a lot of people have been doing and having great success, but the details are important. So catch your young weeds small. And I was talking to a guy who's the allotment mentor for the whole of South West England, popped in yesterday, and he's keen no dig, and he said he is amazed on allotments how much resistance he meets with the idea, and he sees people going up and down their allotments with a rotavator, and then he sees them being overwhelmed by the annual weeds, because annual weed seeds are all brought up by rotavator, and also rotavated soil needs to recover. I think there's no doubt about this. I can't prove it, but I use that word recover in the sense of if someone kicks and punches you, you need to recover. I think that's what rotavating does to soil. And one way that soil can recover is by growing weeds. And if you think about it, weeds recover the soil. And I think those words match exactly. And I've noticed myself, because I've used a rotavator. I grew up on a farm and rotavated fields, and then see forests of chickweed following the rotavator. I think it's a very fast growing weed, and it helps the soil to recover from rotavating. And no dig, we are not aggressing the soil. So it doesn't need to do that. And people come into my garden are always amazed. Where's the weeds? What are you doing? Certainly I'm doing that hoeing that I've described, but mostly there's a lot less weeding to do. So once you've got rid of your perennial weeds, you're having a ball. It's fantastic. And if it's too wet to hoe, you can hand weed. But that's the size again. It's much easier to pull out a small weed than a big one. So why let it get bigger? You know, go in there, deal with them when they're tiny, and then you'll have the great satisfaction of having a clean plant. Weeds never get to the stage where you've got to deal with a big problem. Looking the other way at homemakers, on the left is where I was using more polythene mulches in the first year, and that was examples from the beginning and the end of the first season. And there's an interesting plant there actually on the left. You see there's some very little green dots, and that's perennial kale. And I'm really kicking myself actually. I only brought along I think one plant this evening, but that's it. Taunton Dean. So this is a plant that will live for many years and just keep giving you leaves. It doesn't go to seed. And that's it in the right hand picture on the left. And also in that photograph is my asparagus bed, which I planted. Just put the crowns into compost on top of decaying pasture. Out of interest, I looked it up on the RHS website after that. And the RHS said in no uncertain terms, before planting asparagus, you must dig. Preferably double dig. You know, there it is in black and white for the whole nation to see. And this is one of the reasons why no dig doesn't really get anywhere, except by very slow accretion at grassroots level, because you've got people out there, RHS, telling people all the time, dig, rotate, whatever it might be. And that does cause me some grief, I have to say. But going on, look at the asparagus on the right there. So that's no-dig asparagus in only its third summer. It's 7 feet high, forest, totally abundant, and this year, in the fourth spring, we've been picking lots of asparagus. We're even a year ahead of schedule. No-dig, it just works. And you can also see in the left, in both pictures, on the left is the perennial kale. So it's 3 years old in that one. In fact, I think the next picture might show it. There we are. So that's Taunton Dean kale. There are other varieties of perennial kale, but do check them out because you know, they really are perennial. But having said that, all perennial vegetables need some maintenance. You know, it's not like you plant it, hey, that's really easy, and then walk away and you just go back and gather some food now and then. You've got to look after them and prune them and tidy them and obviously weed them and sometimes separate them or whatever it might be. But you know, there's no easy answers in any of this, but there's some that are a lot better than others. This is potatoes no-dig, so there I'm putting tubers of Charlotte, which is a variety I warmly recommend. Some of you will know it, I'm sure. And I put them just on top of the decaying pasture, which I previously mulched with hay the previous November. And then 4 or 5 inches, that's well-rotted cow manure. When I say compost, by the way, it could be well-rotted manure, it could be leaf mould, it could be green waste compost, it could be your own compost, whatever, anything well-rotted. And the result of doing that is very little weeding and abundant harvest again. So that's the same Charlotte that I'm pulling there, not using a fork even, but just pulling the stem and all the tubers are in the compost. They also come out a lot cleaner, interestingly. Come out a lot cleaner from compost than they do if you disturb the soil and grow them in soil. And roots have no problem going down. You know, this is a lot of misunderstanding from people who are used to digging. They say, how are my parsnips going to go down? They just want to, you know, that's what they do. The problem is getting them out. So you can see they're very long, and what I do is I use my copper spade, put it in, and just leave it while I'm pulling on the crown of the parsnip until it comes out. And sometimes you get these amazing 2-3 foot long fine roots going down. Very satisfying, because you can see therefore how open the soil is, and that's clay soil. My previous garden was really quite yellow clay. For fruit trees, so I'm mulching using, again, cardboard and compost, a pretty standard recipe, but I've varied it a bit there. I've used this plastic membrane on top, which I've used very little in the vegetable garden, but for long-term trees I thought that might be useful, keep the mulch in place. The only snag was, of course, it does have nice worms under there, and then the badgers discovered that. We got a lot of badgers, and they came along looking for worms and rooted up the membrane. But the trees grew really well, so very small sticks basically. That's the cheapest way to plant a tree, 1 year maiden. And that was first summer, second summer. And so they're now, already very quickly, that's the third summer. So that's 2.5 years after planting this little stick. When it's well mulched and tended, and you know, the soil has been fed, carefully pruned. Pruning, though, is another subject that's been massively complicated, and there's just a few principles of pruning you need to know, and you can do all your own very successfully. Here's experiments I run. So, dig and no-dig, I'm comparing the effects by growing the same vegetables in dug soil on the left, undug on the right in each case. And this was my earlier experiment at Lower Farm. You can see the results at the top there. To my surprise, I must admit, I'm actually getting more kilos from the no-dig over many years. Not a lot in it, but the main conclusion is, even if it was exactly the same, why go to all that extra work and trouble of digging? Because it's not only the yield actually being more without digging, but the fact that dug soil has all these extra weeds. Doesn't hold on to moisture so much, it's more difficult to water. It's actually such a no-brainer, really, when you think about it. Has the world gone crazy? So there I am, a rare photograph of me actually digging. And that is when I arrived at Homemaker, so I was creating no-dig experiment again. And what I do with the dug bed is I make a trench and then tip the compost into that, whereas on the no-dig bed on the right, I put the same amount of compost on top. So it's basically 2 beds, same ingredients. One, the soil has been inverted, compost incorporated, the other one is simply on top. It was about 7 hours work on the left, 2.5 hours on the right. And then pathway in the middle, again, mulch, cardboard. Got a friend who's a joiner and he gave me some sawdust and wood shavings. And that's just a question, I'm not necessarily advocating them, but it's a question of using what's available. Yeah, a lot of it's about that. Use what you can get hold of. But learn about it, how suitable it is, and use it accordingly. And then here, this is another time-saving trick. Hardening off. You know, it's one of those slightly mystical words that are used by gardeners, and people who aren't gardening, what are you hardening off? What are you talking about? And it's what is recommended to do for tender plants, that is, plants that don't like being out in the cold much or whatever, if you've raised them under cover before you plant them out. And you know, the way it's often described, you take them out in the day, bring them in at night, out in the day again, bring them out, do that for a week, and then maybe bring them out all day for a couple of days, and then you can finally plant them. And actually what we do is take them straight out of the greenhouse, put them in the ground, unheated or anything, but then put this fleece on top. And it's a wonderful product, this fleece. It's very thin polymer. It's like a giant cobweb, holds in warmth if it's sunny, and keeps the wind off plants. So it's like a kind of half greenhouse. And this, in fact, was Homemaker's garden this spring. Do you remember we had a really cold April? It seems a distant memory now in the warmth we're having, but the photograph on the right is what Homemaker's garden looked like April 28th this year. So it's only actually 6 weeks ago. And nearly all my beds were fleeced. You can see that was a -3 frost there. And yet the plants underneath, the fleece doesn't keep all the frost out, but it was mainly
very cold winds in the day, it was keeping that off and keeping warmth in. And then, we've got abundance now. So this is the dig no dig experiment, always with the dug bed on the left. Can you see much difference? I mean, there are subtle differences. But, mostly when people look at those beds, it's like, wow, which is which? And one thing I do notice is slightly more glossy leaves than the no dig, but that's very difficult to catch on the camera. Basically, I'm keeping records of all the harvests. It's on my website. I won't go into that now, but if you look under the land banner, it's got trials, and you can see all these tables, records of harvest. Fascinating. I think it's fascinating. One thing I do notice, though, it's not a yield difference. Perhaps it's a quality difference. So that's potatoes from the dug bed on the left and dug on the right, and how they're coming cleaner out of the undug. And in no dig, you're growing the tubers in the compost, and they're rooting into the soil below. And likewise, carrots and parsnips. So in each of those photos, there's dug produce on the left. And you can see, in fact, the dug parsnips have forked a bit more than the no-dig ones. So I think because the soil is just not disturbed, it's very simple. The root just has one choice. Down you go. Nothing's being fractured or messed around with. And they grow very long. Here I was working with some Japanese farmers, and they do a practice called shume, or Japanese natural agriculture. They have a farm near Acre, and their way of farming, which has been very successful all over the world, completely blows away a few tenants. Like they don't do any rotation, they believe in continuous cropping, but they do save their own seed, and they also don't believe in using compost. Well, they say they don't anyway. But anyway, so I thought it would be interesting to work with them, set up a trial. So we did a 3-bed comparison where the first one has been dug with no compost, the second one no dig with no compost again, third one no dig with some compost, and then planted the same vegetables into each strip to see what happens. And the no dig without compost was the slowest to get going. Caught up in the first year in the end. And then I was looking at this experiment, oh God, I didn't find I could carry on not using compost actually, because what happened in the first year, the harvest from those 3 strips, the first one was 41, the second one 40, and the third one 65. So adding 2 inches of compost gave more than 50% extra produce. And because I'm a commercial market gardener, I just couldn't bear the thought of carrying on, doing basically the same amount of work for 50% less produce. So with Steph, my partner, we spread some compost like on the left there. 2 inches of green waste compost, that's all. Not a major amount, not expensive. And the results have been fantastic every year actually. All 3 strips. The first strip though is still dug. And if you want to use a green manure, which is another big source of confusion sometimes, because of the issue of digging it in, that's a very good one to use. It's white mustard, agricultural mustard, the one on the left, killed by frost. So on the right you can see January, -5 centigrade, and it's pretty well dead. So you just rake it off as a straw. And that was the amazing harvest on this experiment from 6 squash plants. If you're growing squash, I warmly recommend this variety, curry, Japanese. A lot of good varieties come from Japan. And it gave 55 kilos from 6 plants. Just those 6 plants you can see behind the beans. With yields like that, how big a space do you need? Because the beauty of a squash, this is winter squash, so those squash get dry, hard. You can store them in your living room, if you've got a conservatory, or anywhere in the house basically. They keep best when they're warm and dry. And you've got available food there until March, the following spring. So for 6 months a year, you've got a source of food sitting. Put it on television in your living room if you want, whatever. It's like an easy thing to store, and you haven't got to go out and buy your food. And here's another one that's brilliant in that respect, and that's runner beans, not picked as green pods, allowed to ripen on the plant for a seed harvest. And the variety I recommend for this is Czar, C-Z-A-R. And that's because it's a white bean of great flavour. There it is on the left.
So that's just runner bean grown in exactly the same way as all runner beans, but not harvested as green pods in the summer, allowed to mature on the plant, harvested late September, October. And on the right is borlotti beans. So there's a very simple example of using something you know well, but in a slightly different way, to get fantastic food, because I'm sure they're hugely nutritious. They taste superb, I can tell you that. You just can't buy beans with that flavour anywhere, I don't think. People who come on courses at homemakers, say, wow, these beans are amazing, just without any sauce or anything. And simple to grow, and you just put them in a jar, you've got your food there. Like, we'll be having some for lunch tomorrow, following June, it's easy. This was the results from that 3-strip experiment last year. And again, the dug strip on the left, the results are slightly lower. The 2 undug ones, with the same amount of compost but different composts, are slightly higher for less work. And then growing organic veg, pest control, so mostly I'm not using much pest control because I'm sowing in season and then plants grow more healthily, and with the compost mulches they resist the pests to a point. There's certain pests I need to protect, like using mesh against butterflies on the brassicas, for example, and there's actually one spray, it's the only spray I use, Bacillus thuringiensis. It is a soil bacterium which has been given a bad name, unfortunately, because it's the one that Monsanto put into BT cotton. That BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, which should not be in cotton, because it's a soil bacterium, and it's perfectly safe to spray on brassica plants, and caterpillars, when they eat the brassica leaves, they get indigestion, which is a polite way of saying they die, and it doesn't affect mammals. So that's something you can do if you need to. And then mulching again, polytunnel. If you've got space, polytunnel can be an absolute godsend, because not only your crops, but you can be in there in adverse weather, and as a result you'll be growing amazing food out of season even, but all year round. So again, I'm doing thorough mulching there. I was using cardboard as well as compost, which is certainly an option if you've got really bad weeds, to get the soil clear of perennial weeds very quickly, and then planting into it, and that's in the first spring. And then tomatoes, one of my favourite crops to grow, but very time-demanding crop, and I don't put them too close, and then I'm very careful watering, so that's the way you avoid blight. Keep your leaves dry. Doesn't matter at the moment because there's no blight around, but from about early July onwards. And I'm taking off the lower leaves, but leaving the top ones. You need to leave the higher leaves because that brings the flavour, the sweetness. And then watering, not over-watering, watering 2 or 3 times a week, certainly not every day. And also with tomatoes, I don't feed them at all. So that's another big time-saving job done. And there's enough goodness in the compost in the soil that I don't need to feed. You certainly don't need any tonne rope. All these products you don't need. That's Big Boy, one of the biggest ones. And then clearing the tomatoes in October. 2 tips for tomatoes to get them to ripen more for you. One is slacken off on watering in September. So if you water less, your plants are slightly stressed, and they're thinking, not literally, but they're thinking, we need to ripen the fruit rather than make new ones. And then you pinch out the tops on August the 10th. So that's removing the plant's ability to make any more new growth, and just keep side shooting from then on. So if you're on holiday on August the 10th, get your neighbour to do it, whatever. But that way you can be pretty sure that you'll have reasonably ripe fruit and not too many green ones by late September, October, and then any remaining green ones that are mostly well formed, you just pick them, put them in a box, keep them in your sitting room again, wherever, somewhere warm, and just pick them out as they ripen. Then we're again breaking the rules there, walking on the beds a bit, just to break up any lumps from pulling out the tomatoes and even it off. Feet are a great tool, I use feet quite a bit. And then that's ready for planting. So for me the most valuable crop in the winter is salad. It's actually the most valuable crop that I grow at all, and that's why I brought along a few bags for sale. This is what we were picking this morning. If you want to make a bit of money growing vegetables, bags of salad leaves is something to look at if you've got a market for them nearby, because it's the highest value vegetable basically. When we buy bags of leaves like that, we're sort of, price-wise, we're kind of, in our mind I think we're thinking in terms of ready meal. So we're prepared to pay a higher price than if it was, say, a bunch of beetroot or something. It's a vegetable, you know, that's a meal. And I sell quite a few of these to restaurants, and they do give them a rinse, but then they just put them straight on the plate and they get a lot of added value out of that. But these are very easy to grow at home. You can get a large amount from a small area. So even in winter, my polytunnel fills up, we fill it up with salad plants. Winter salad's more interesting flavour actually than what we're growing at the moment really. So a lot of salad rocket, wild rocket, pak choi, purslane, winter purslane that is, sorrel, leaf radish, mustards of all types, they're amazing, spinach, and one particular lettuce called Grenoble Red, which I couldn't recommend warmly enough. So that's on the left, unheated polytunnel, January. You know, it's quite incredible how much you can get. That's a warm winter though, it must be said. And I'm in Somerset, I think your winters here might be a bit colder. So, you know, that's slightly different. But you can still do it. There are salad growers around here doing it. That's mustards on the left with good example. No dig soil, you get healthy fungi growing. You know, if you see that kind of thing on toadstools, rejoice. It's a good sign. Your soil is in good health. It's growing fungi. And here I actually dug a hole because I wanted to see what does it look like in my no-dig bed. This was a patch of ground I'd taken on 11 years previous where the soil had been compacted by my kind brother's heavy machinery. And so it was not in a good condition. Anyway, 11 years of mulching with 1.5 inches of compost. And I dug a hole to see, and you can see it's yellow clay. And at the bottom I was really thrilled to find all those holes at the bottom, 16 inches down. Loads of wormholes. And I was talking about it with Felix, who's working with me at the moment, and he was saying now that, you know, recent research is showing how earthworms live for up to 8 years. Yeah, imagine that. Imagine if you kill an earthworm when you dig or something. Yes. So and all that time they're living there making just one hole, one channel. So if that gets broken, apparently quite a few of them die. You know, all the good that earthworms doing, so you can see there at the bottom of that hole, not really the one, but sorry about digging a hole there, but basically you see so many holes. If you look at that picture, the little round holes at the bottom of that, in yellow clay. So although it's yellow clay, very dense, it's open. And that's no dig, it's about having firm but open soil. And here's an example of how to help that. So here we're making compost and using whatever we can get hold of, basically organic matter. So this was a heap made just 4 or 5 weeks ago. The hod there is from the lawnmower, and it's where I run it over some woody stuff, twigs and things, so that's broken up pieces of little twigs of wood. And then one wheelbarrow has fresh horse manure, which I happen to have because the neighbour's got that, and I can get old straw from her. But you know, it's a question of, I'm just using that because it's available and very easy and free. If you look around, I think you might be surprised what you can find, leaves and all that kind of thing. Nettles on the left there. So we make a heap and then, you know, making nice compost to spread. This was my partner Steph's allotment, so that's Bruton clay, covered in greenmost compost. That's quite a good option. That cost her £80 to cover that allotment there, 4 tonnes of compost, that £20 a tonne to live. I think, you know, money of that order is the best investment you can make. So this was making that heap, and I'm just tamping it down to really push everything in, and then the photo on the right is only 12 days later. It had got really warm. You know, you can make compost fast. I'm not saying you have to necessarily. You can also make really nice compost very slowly, but there's many, many ways of making compost. And the main thing I think actually that we're discovering is not to have too much water, particularly in summer when you're adding quite a lot of green matter. Most green matter has a lot of moisture in which comes out as it breaks down in the compost heap. And so your compost might look a bit dry at the time you're assembling a heap, But in time, I think you'll find that moisture level will stabilise to a point where you want it. The worst enemy of compost, I think, is excess water that displaces air. Air's the key ingredient. And that's actually spreading that same compost, aged 26 days, on a piece of weedy ground, and then covering it with polythene to plant winter squash. So there's a use for homemade compost. This kind of, at that stage, it doesn't need to be perfect, fine, crumbly compost. That's just for planting squash. You could plant potatoes into that, for example. You know, different vegetables have different requirements. This was Steph's allotment again, so going from May to September, and there she's double cropping. So there's this thing, you know, coming up soon. It's going to be time to harvest garlic and onions. What are you going to grow then? There's still time to grow endives, chicories, even Brussels sprouts, kale, broccoli, that you sow now. Now is a really key time for sowing. Kale, purple sprouting, cauliflowers, calabrese, beetroot, winter carrots. You know, a lot of sowing happens in March and April. There's a lot of sowing happens in June and July as well. So you want to stay on the ball, make some notes, and remember the days that are good for it. There she is with her Brussels sprouts in November. So they were sown in early June, planted second week in July. This was mulching at home acres, so again, similar story on very weedy ground, a lot of couch grass, but using just 3 inches of compost there and this polythene mulch on top, planting through it, winter squash and potatoes, and there's potato harvest. So again, tubers growing in the surface mulch, rooting into the undisturbed soil, and that was the later, in the same year, harvest of squash. Personally, my two favourite varieties are the red curry I mentioned, and then that one on the left, Crown Prince. Some of you probably know that. For flavour, it's just unbeatable, and sweet density of its flesh. Then the following year, these two beds had lettuce, and this is an example of how we pick lettuce. This is a massive time saver once you get the hang of it. It's taking off the outer leaves, never using a knife. Being very kind to your lettuce plants. So that's before picking. Next picture is after. And then we do that every week. So then a week later, we plant the bed looks like that again. And then we pick again. And we're just doing that. And that means you don't need many plants. They're grown in healthy soil, at a sensible spacing, carefully picked. You know, these are all quite skillful things, but skills you can learn. Skills that empower you to get a lot of food from not many plants, not a big area. In my quarter acre in Somerset, last year I sold £21,000 worth of produce, to give you an idea, from a quarter acre. But one way I can get that high value is from salad leaves. You know, if it was cauliflowers and carrots, I wouldn't be getting anywhere near that. But salad's amazing for that. And looking after your salad plants, so again here, those same lettuce plants 2 months later, they're just finishing cropping as they go up to flower. But I've already underplanted salad rocket and mustards. So overlapping crops, that's another thing that's made much easier by no-dig. You can just plot things in while something else is finishing. Quite often I plant beetroot between my onions while the onions are ripening. And the beetroot gets smothered a bit while the onions are just finishing off, but they survive, and then you harvest the onions, and you've got, what you have is an established plant. Oh, it races away. There's your second harvest. And I'm not spreading any compost in the summer, so the soil food is all happening in the winter. For example, broad beans on the left were followed by, under the mesh, there is Chinese cabbage. And there's no compost being added in the summer, it's just simply popping in more plants. So very quick. Summer's busy time, you don't want to be doing too many extra jobs. Here's lettuce picking method in a bit more detail with actually more mature plants than I would normally use. So this is before and after. They look a bit surprised on the left. But 10 days later, you can see the regrowth is phenomenal. I find on the whole lettuce grows about 1 leaf a day in the summer months, from early May to early October. So imagine that, each one, you don't need many. And the method is twisting downwards, picking around, just taking off the larger leaves. The first 2 or 3 picks are more difficult because the soil is close, the lettuce plant is right in the compost. But as they get more mature, they rise up, you have a little lettuce tree, and it's easier to pick the leaves off until they finally go to flower. With one plant well, two actually. This one and the wild rocket, I use a knife, endive. This is frizzy endive. But mostly, we're using fingers and thumb. We were picking a lot of salads, wanting spinach as well, and it was just hand work, no knives at all. Here is filling a bed, so examples of, if you only have a small space, it's worth having a wooden-sided bed. Mostly I try not to have too much wood around because it does tend to harbour slugs. But, if this is a small area in a gravel yard, worked very well to make a bed. 3 inches horse manure, 3 inches green waste comp. That's on weedy pasture, almost entirely well-rotted cow manure, just simply on top of the grass, bit of cardboard around the edge to stop the weeds coming in. 1 month later on the left, you haven't got to wait for the weeds to die. Plant straight away, off you go. Following spring, carrots. That's another terrible myth that's out there. People say, oh, you shouldn't spread compost, they're only going to save carrots and parsnips because it makes them fall. Utter nonsense. And yet that, because it's a force of repetition. Goebbels was absolutely right. If you say something often enough, it will come true, or people will believe it, even though there's no evidence for it. And actually, there's a book written by Leesdale and Salter in 1980, 79, 81, Know and Grow Vegetables, and they, at the Government Research Institute, they trialled this, and they could not make carrots, parsnips fall by adding organic matter. Basically, what their finding was, the effect it has, you get more carrot and parsnip, because the soil is enriched. I mean, the harvest of carrots are quite phenomenal, growing in compost. If you want slugs, it's very simple, you grow patch off. They just love it. And I struggle to grow a good patch soil. Has anyone here managed to grow a good patch soil? If so, no? But to be honest, I'm not surprised. Personally, I think it's the hardest vegetable. I don't know what it is, whether it's more adapted to the Japanese climate, Chinese, or what. But in Britain, I find it gets slugged a lot. Compared to other vegetables, which I don't have any problems with at all. Chinese cabbage is the other one, but the nice thing here is to demonstrate what slugs are doing. Why are we plagued by slugs sometimes? What they do, what's their role? They do have a role in nature, believe it or not. They're clearing up the decaying leaves. They're recycling agents, for want of a better word. And if you look at the harvest there, so that's those same slug-infested Chinese cabbages actually had clean hearts, because the slugs are interested mostly in the rotting outer leaves. They're less interested in the hearts of those Chinese cabbage, which were healthy and vibrant. So grown in good soil. And there's other things you can do, I'll mention in a minute, sowing by the moon, biodynamic preparations. Anybody use biodynamic preparations? It's worth a look. I might lose you here, I don't know how interested you are in these things, but to give you an example of that, nobody, again, a bit like the copper tools, nobody really understands, I don't think, how biodynamics works. But it's been proven in the field many times. There are lots of good examples of it being effective. In my myths book, I haven't got an example here, it's up there for sale. I talk about moon sowing and planting, and my publisher, Green Book, sent the myths book to a very eminent professor in Sheffield, who asking whether he would review this book. And he returned the book and said, no, I can't possibly review this book because it mentions biodynamics. And it's like, what? And I thought, hang on, I didn't think I mentioned biodynamics in my myths book. So I had a look in the index, it's not there. And then I realised what he'd done is, I wrote about moon sowing by the moon, timings. And he made the false assumption that that is biodynamics, because it's not. Sowing by the moon has been around since before Jesus Christ. It's an old farming and gardening practice. Biodynamics was invented by Rudolf Steiner in 1924 when he gave his first lecture. So the two, although they overlap, they're not the same thing at all. And this eminent professor, making a very unprofessorial comment there, just totally wrong, basically. So it just shows the level of misunderstanding about these things that's out there, and misinterpretation and misinformation, really. But biodynamics, I think, can help you very simply and very cheaply to get good soil energy, which helps your plants to be more healthy, more pest resistant. And then another way of getting more pest resistance is raising strong, healthy plants by sowing at the right time. So, for example, one of the first sowings I make every year is peas. Late January, early February, indoors on the windowsill often, so they're pushing for the light a bit, need to go out there. Peas, very frost hardy, really quite easy to germinate. I save my own seed, that's quite an easy thing with peas too. And then I give a bit of warmth in the greenhouse, so on the left, in my old greenhouse at Birmingham, I had electric propagator. Homemakers is off-grid, so on the right, this is making a hotbed with fresh horse manure. So here's something that if you can just get hold of it, that might be more tricky in Birmingham, I don't know how things are around here. I mean, down our part of the world, a lot of people have horses, there's loads of this fresh manure going for free. I mean, if you have enough hamsters or gerbils, you can do it. Basically, what you need is a decent mass or quantity of fresh manure, and that's a source of heat. So we pile it into the 4x4 enclosure there, put a wooden pallet frame on top, and germinate seedlings in that. And the warmth rising from the compost, before it can escape out of the glass, it just goes through that germinating trays of seedlings. Really effective. And in a spring, I reckon I germinate around 4,000, maybe 5,000 seeds and seedlings on that hotbed, because they're not on it for long, 2-3 weeks, and then they go onto a cold bench. It just gets everything going, and you get much stronger, healthier growth. That was in effect why I hadn't opened the window in the greenhouse. A lot of vapours coming off the hotbed. And then by early spring, it's ready for a top-up. So because it's fresh manure, it just sinks like a compost heap. So at that stage, you can take off everything and put some more fresh on top. That keeps the heat going. So propagation, there's a lot of skill involved in propagation, but it's not difficult. It's worth learning. So pricking out, this one's often mistaught too. On my courses where I'm teaching pricking out, and I show just little seedlings, tiny. And then I go, we were told, they had to wait till you see the first true leaf. No, you can do it really small, and it's actually much easier, much quicker, and they transplant better. And we like that for planting too. Plant them small. Don't wait until they're enormous. So that's celeriac, for example, on the left. That's plenty big enough to go out, turning into nice bulbs by October. So if you can get equipment like those polystyrene trays, for example, sometimes they can be had for free at nurseries if you hunt around, scrounge a bit. This is where I think, again, there's a bit of a conspiracy to not let us have the tools we need. It's amazingly difficult to get good propagating kit that you can reuse. The only stuff you can buy is what falls apart within a year, and you've got to rebuy it. And not only does it do that and it costs you money, but it falls apart literally while you're trying to plant something and damages the roots. Whereas if you've got a good sturdy tray, those actually were sold by B&Q, the ones on the right in that first photograph, and they don't sell them anymore. I think probably they found they were too good and weren't getting repeat buys. But basically I'm trying to raise, even clumps of plants like peas I plant out 3 in a clump like that, for example. Onions and beetroot in a clump. This saves time because you add space and compost. You're raising 4, 5, 6 plants in the same amount of compost in the same amount of space, planting them out in the same amount of time, and getting all that instead. So you see how the beetroot push one another apart. So that's how we do all the beetroot. Onions likewise pushing each other apart in these clumps. Salads I mostly grow singles, but some, like the leaf radish on the left, are very big leaf plants, so they grow 2 or 3. So you can use it's a way of spacing growing things in clumps. And planting in clumps, I think, you're planting lots of friends together. They're single plants, wide spacing, sometimes they get lonely, and that doesn't help them to grow. Whereas if you give them some mates, they get away better. Multi-sow. Here's an example of using different compost. So on the left is multi-purpose, on the right is again another example of something that all the rule books say you shouldn't do. That's manure. 18-month-old, so it's well rotted, horse manure. And the seedling trays on the right, you can see there after 4 weeks, and actually the plant's very happy in that well rotted manure. And in this photograph I was trialling some different compost, potting compost, except the one on the left wasn't really a potting compost, it was just a seed. It's green waste compost which has got quite a bit of wood in it. So that's already the effect on the lettuce, the wood takes the food, and look at the result there. So you can see how the lettuce growing in compost with lots of wood around the roots just can't grow. It's, you know, the wood's taking it. And that's why wood mulches are good as long as you don't dig them in. If they're on the surface, that's okay. But your plants don't want wood, you know, wherever they're rooting, deeper into the soil. That's a bit of undersowing, some things you can do with no dig when you've got no weeds. And then moon, so that's prime time now in this photograph, 2 days before full moon. I should have checked my moon calendar before coming actually, but I think it's about 2 weeks till the next time this happens. It's the only snag with this method, that if you sow seeds 2 days before the full moon, 3 maybe is okay, even 1.5, but around that time, the energy is strongest. It's that kind of werewolf energy, full on, everything's buzzing, and the seeds pick that up. It's like the horoscope they get when they hit the compost or soil. It's the same whether you're sowing into, you know, into pots in the greenhouse or whatever. And that's the horoscope they carry in their life. You get bigger plants. I'm not saying they're always better necessarily, but it just tends to leap out of the soil very vigorously. And on the right, carrots sown 2 days before full moon. On the left, 1 day after. And then, you know, the harvest is good either way. It's not like this is going to solve all your problems or whatever it might be, but there are interesting differences. 10% more carrots in that case from sowing 2 days before full moon, which slightly contradicts the old saw that is said where you should sow root vegetables on a waning moon, because the waning moon is a downward yin energy that kind of encourages roots to go down. And that may well be true as well, but it actually shows how in this whole field of moon sowing, there are so many factors at play. Again, I don't think we really understand enough about it to make kind of a sensible commentary. Except it's fascinating, you can do your own little trials, which I keep doing. For example, on the left there, that was Maria Toom's biodynamic calendar I was using, and 2 batches of carrots in that raised bed. The batch on the left was sown on a day when Maria Toom said, don't sow anything, you know, cross through that one. It makes you feel if you sow something on that day, it's just not going to grow. But actually they did. And someone asked Maria Toom once why, does anybody use Maria Toom's calendar? No. Anyway, she always has, every year, Good Friday, Easter Saturday, big black cross, no sowing, no planting. It makes it look, oh, these must be terrible days for going out in the garden. And someone asked her once why, and she said, oh, because I'm a Catholic. So this, you know, it's another example of how things can get muddled a bit and lost in translation. On the right, those carrots were sown on what she calls a root day. So basically when the moon is in a Earth sign, Capricorn, Taurus, for example. And they looked weaker while they were growing, but that's the whole point. Plants putting more energy into the root, less into the leaf. And there were actually 20% more carrots in that half of the bed at harvest time. This is only one trial in 1 year. It doesn't prove the point, but it's an indication. Quite interesting. But then on the left, you know, that's just slightly going the other way, because the, sorry, on the right photo, the carrots on the left is a right photo. I sowed them again on a day when all the calendars said don't do anything. That was last year, I don't know if you remember, March 20th, there was a solar eclipse, reckoned to be really bad for sowing seeds. That's what I see. Okay, it's fine. And just finishing off with a few unusual plants. Does anybody recognise this one? It's not a vegetable, but it's something you might well have used in something you drink. You can buy it in supermarkets now, I believe, as a white pill.
Stevia.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, stevia. Stevia rabunda, it's plant native to more subtropical regions, I think, like Argentina. And it grows best in Britain under cover. So I grew it in the greenhouse from seed. And not easy to get going. Once you got it there, and then I did a big harvest September, put the leaves to dehydrate, and you get green powder that is 300 times sweeter than sugar. But does have quite a strong aftertaste, which is not to everybody's liking. I think the reason supermarkets sell it like as a white pill, they've refined out the sweetness, so you haven't got any of the green vegetables in there. But anyway, if you're intrigued by that, it's something you can do at home. Homegrown sweetener. I'm sure, has anybody grown these? Do you know what they are? Yeah, sweet potato.
Yeah.
So you can see our sweet potato is related to bindweed morning glory. That's the sweet potato plant growing on the left with a kind of morning glory flower. But again, I think these have been massively misrepresented. They've been sold as a, hey, you know, one of these new highly worthwhile vegetables. To be honest, I think they're most highly worthwhile for the people selling the very expensive slips, because in my experience, you don't get a huge yield. That was my best, and it's Carolina Ruby's variety I recommend if you're going to grow more suited to British conditions. But I think you're better off with potatoes actually, much easier, much cheaper. And then there I'm growing ochre. Have you heard of ochre? So that's New Zealand yam is another word for it. And again, this is one of these vegetables from the Andes originally, where they've got an amazing reservoir of plants that we're rediscovering now only. And ochre makes these beautiful clovery leaves that you can eat. Oxalis family, little yellow flowers as well. And then that's a possible harvest from mid-November. You can't harvest them before mid-November. It's frustrating because they're triggered only by short daylight to make their tubers. So you have to wait, and hopefully you get something like that. They're nice, sweet, raw. And this is yakon. I'll just go back to, you can see yakon growing in the middle. Actually, these are the plants I've brought along here because I think these are highly worth growing. And this is ideal time to plant them. These are some I saved from yakon harvest last year. You can save your own buds to make your own plants, so again you become independent. And you get quite a tall plant, like in the middle there, 4 foot high, needs a good 18 inches all around it. And the harvest is easier than ochre. You don't have to wait for really short days. It's all those big tubers that I'm gathering just with a spade to leave them out. Between 3 and 4 kilos I get on average from a plant. And the nickname for yakon is Peruvian earth apple. And it's very apt name because you look at it, you think that's like a big smooth potato. You eat it and it tastes like a fruit. And it doesn't have any fructose or carbohydrates. It's oligosaccharides is the sweetness it has, and very few calories apparently. So it's very watery, but very tasty, very nice roasted actually. And just finishing off, there's to remind me about dates. We've actually got open day if any of you down in Somerset this Sunday. And then there's another one, 4th of September. And also I run day courses at Homemakers, and their dates are on my website. Next one's due July 30th. And finally, that's just going back to what Andy was saying at the beginning, to mention of my videos. There's a lot of information up there on YouTube. And for example, I did one last July on growing tomatoes undercover. That's becoming relevant again now. And my website has a lot of information too. And just one example on the website, I put up what I call a sowing timeline. It's just a very simple document, 2 pages, a list of each month of the year, what's the most suitable thing to sow for the best results. And it doesn't always agree with what the seed packet will tell you, because they tend to put, I think, things, you know, get them to sow the seeds as much as possible, and then they'll have to buy some more. And so there we are. Thank you very much.
So we just calm ourselves down, we'll do like half an hour or whatever of questions. We might go on a bit longer because I reckon Charles is gagging to do like just keep talking about it. It's a passion, you see. We're becoming alchemists. So let's welcome him back with a round of applause. Let's say welcome, Charles.
Thank you. So has anybody got some burning question? Yes.
How do you get the last little bit of roots out of some of these extremely nightmare weeds?
Okay, how do you get the last little bit of root?
Some
What weeds have you got in mind, for example?
Your son holding that one.
Bindweed or whatever. Well, some weeds it's very difficult. And bindweed that I showed you in one of those photographs was 3 years ago, and it's still growing a bit now. So field bindweed I don't think ever quite dies. But I feel that with a combination of mulching and persistent removal of regrowing leaves, I've weakened the root now to the point where it's
easily manageable. So I'm afraid that I can't say.
It's a compromise, isn't it?
Well, yeah, compromise, yeah, for want of a better word. It's the best solution, I would say. And what I've noticed from what people say to me about, when they try and get rid of couch grass, say, by digging, it just keeps coming back. And it's a bit like I was saying about how when you rotivate soil and you get all these weeds coming in, the soil responds to all that intervention by trying to grow more weeds. And I think it's the same with couch, because we're in the photograph, my greenhouse that I put up on top of a patch of ground full of couch grass, now there is none. Zero. Couch grass you can get rid of completely. Ground elder as well, creeping buttercup, dandelion, docks. They can all be got rid of by mulching. Docks actually is one slight exception that I'd recommend digging out. If it's a big dock, take out the top 4 inches minimum. It's about that much. And either they won't regrow or they will regrow so weakly you can just pull them out.
Can I say, push the remaining roots back down into the ground as far as you can get it.
What?
So if you don't get all the roots out, push the remaining bit of root as far back down into the ground and stick a stone on top of it and then bury it.
Okay, well, that's something I've never done, but if you say so.
Ragwort?
Ragwort? Ah, yeah, interesting. I've not had experience of ragwort, so... Yeah. But you're not talking about ragwort in bare soil, are you? You're talking about in pasture, probably, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's slightly different. Yeah, I'm afraid I can't help you there.
Horsetail?
Horsetail. Yeah, no, that one. So who is else? Right. Yeah, same. Persistent pulling, mulching, hoeing. You can only weaken it. The roots go down forever.
Some of the places on our allotments, it's a bit wetter down the bottom end. The whole plot is just full of maize.
Yeah, it loves damp soil, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And
I'm
yeah.
lucky where I am up the top. Is quite up the hill.
Right.
I wanted to ask you about my soil on the other side. It's got a bit cracked. And, with the mulching, I just put it on top and let it fill the cracks in.
You mean it's cracked because it's a bit dry, presumably?
Yeah.
So it's quite heavy soil, cracking open.
Yeah.
Cracking is good stuff, so I mean it's letting air in, at least. But yeah, I would do that exactly and let the mulch fall down the cracks, and worms will thank you for that.
Yeah.
With the mulch, is there a point where it can be too deep? Because we've got beds and then we've got balls for year on it and then we've actually got some ordinary soil on it. Is it that it can be, too deep? That's what I'm saying basically.
Oh, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by too deep, but I've heard of people making like 2 foot high beds.
Yeah, like, say 2 foot high, something like that.
The thing is, if you say you made a 2 foot high bed and you managed to find enough compost or well rotted, whatever it might be to fill it, then very quickly that level will disappear or shrink to half that.
Yeah.
If you want to make a really deep bed, say to save bending over much, actually better to put the bottom layer of soil, because that will hold its volume for longer and keep your compost for the top layer only, for example. Yeah.
With onions, I say if you put onions in too much compost, it burns the roots. So how do you do your onions without burning the roots?
Who says this and what
Or
they
is
say?
that a myth?
Yeah, they say. Yeah,
And the worms eat the carrots.
These sayings, they sort of started off with a grain of truth, but I think they've got changed. And you're talking about, I would say, putting onions into quite fresh manure. That would burn the roots. That would burn the roots of anything. But compost is well rotted. It's like it's almost soil.
It can't be too rich.
Well, what can happen, I think, if you say, I've noticed where I grow onions in well-rotted cow manure, that's one of the richest. Cow manure is very high in nutrients. And you can get a slight emphasis of leaf, which can sometimes actually lead to mildew on the roots. So, there can be problems like that, but it's certainly, I wouldn't say that burns the roots. Do you have a question?
I was just going to say, which compost would you say would be one of the best or the best two or three composts? Without mentioning too many.
Yeah, which compost is best? Well, I think your own garden compost is really good in most situations. As long as,
Grass cuttings.
Yeah, well, funny you say that, but actually, grass clippings and mows, we have been finding they can make the compost too soggy if you're not careful. You do need the ideal, you know, again, this is sometimes made sound too difficult, really, but you do need a rough balance between green ingredients and brown ingredients. And the green is fresh green leaves of any kind, weeds, whatever, and brown is things like soil, twigs, straw, hay, you know, anything dry and foamed. Hay, also, paper, cardboard. So, you know, there's lots of potential for finding this stuff. It's just getting organised and finding time, really. But if you can get roughly half green, half brown, you get that, you know, reasonably distributed through your heap. You know, you will get there. Having said that, you know, I'm probably a bit more scientific about it than my partner, Steph. Makes amazing compost by just chucking mostly all her weeds and crop residues in one of those big Dalek plastic compost bins and leaves it for a year. Lifts it off and it's all nice and black and crumbly. But her magic ingredient, actually, she's got a rabbit, pet rabbit. So rabbit droppings with a bit of the bedding. So a little bit of animal manure can make all the difference. And actually human manure, that's another whole subject to be explored really. You know, there's a bigger version to it, but it would be a fantastic activator in compost.
Do you turn or not turn?
Or turns or not turns? Well, it depends how much time you got really. Like, Steph doesn't turn her leaves, they're still good. I turn mine, it just goes a bit quicker, I think. If you turn that, mixes it, makes it finer and introduce a bit of air, off it goes again.
So how often would you turn your compost? How often would you turn the heap?
How often do you turn it?
Yeah.
Personally, I only turn my heap once. But some people turn their heaps 2, 3, 4 times and they'll get quicker compost with more heat. So it's not that there's any right or wrong about it, it's just how much time you want to put in and how quickly you want to get a result. Actually, question, yeah.
I was going to ask, I've got an asparagus bed, it's quite big, probably a metre and a half wide and maybe 3 or 4 metres long. And if you read all the books, they say you can't grow anything else with asparagus, you've got a dedicated bed to it. But I'm really envious of that space that I leave, essentially fallow until 6 weeks of the year when I can crop the asparagus. Is there anything I can grow in the asparagus bed to make use of that precious space?
Yeah, that's a very good question actually. Something I did try once was growing early beetroot in an asparagus bed, but it's worth looking at, but whatever you grow will be slightly competing with your asparagus roots that are trying to grow there, even when the soil is looking quite bare. There's something that has occurred to me would be garlic, for example, because you can plant that in November, December when the asparagus is going dormant. There's a lot of it's growing while the asparagus isn't doing much. Garlic's a bit of an amazing vegetable for that. I tried some this year under or between apple trees. And because apples are a bit like asparagus, they're not doing much between November and May even. And when garlic does most of its growing. So, yeah, have a go.
Do you have bees in your compost? I opened my Dowding bin today to find a lot of bees in there, and I'm thinking, are they nesting in there? I don't know.
I don't know.
No, it's hard to
There's a million kinds of bees, so it might be some compost bee.
Yeah, the compost bee, yeah.
I mean, one lovely thing in compost heaps one often finds is slow worms. Anyone have them? Slow worms are big, they look like mini snakes and they're shiny grey. And
this is very little plates.
Oh yeah. Because slow worms eat slugs, that's maybe a reason why I mentioned it. Yeah. Right at the back.
Yeah. What was your experience with growing in clay in regards to the yield of it?
Actually, clay soils are some of the best for growing because clay holds moisture and holds nutrients. Clay is easier than sand in the end. If I had a choice between clay and sand, I'd go for clay every time. The question is though, do you remember one of the photos I showed there was a hole I dug, and that was clay soil. And I've also grown on clay soil in France where I had a small farm for a while, and it was the worst kind of clay. It was white clay, really wet in winter and rock hard in the summer. And the reason I was able to buy the farm even was just because it was such horrible soil, none of the local farmers wanted it, so I was there for it. But this clay responded really well to no dig, mulching on top, because clay's okay soil basically. It more becomes difficult when we try and impose our will upon it. So do be encouraged. No dig is good for clay.
What was the yield like?
Well, higher, because clay is rich. Like I say, it holds on to nutrients, and particularly good for, you spread compost at any time of year on clay, and the goodness will just gradually...
Yeah, the reason why I put the question to you, it's partly spiritual, it said we all have feet of clay. And that's what we were fashioned out of. Creation over evolution. Clay.
Thank you, that's a really nice thought.
So I want to ask, with the main garden that you were talking about, that you developed, did you generate enough material there to create enough compost to do your kind of mulching?
No, I mean not with market gardening. What I'm doing, I'm producing huge amounts of food to sell, and I'm going for really high yields in a very small area, and for that I do need to import tonnages. and to give you a ballpark figure, Elliot Coleman, for example, very well-known organic grower in the USA, 60 tonnes an acre, he reckons. That's over decades of experience. And I would agree with that, not far off. I would say minimum 40 tonnes per acre. If you think in traditional allotments, there are 16 allotments in an acre. So 16 into 40, we'll say 3. So if you have an allotment, all right, if you have 3 tonnes a year, you're fine. Steph is managing with about 2, but it just give you an idea. These figures, should be attainable. I don't know, municipal compost in Birmingham or wherever around you, is it available?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, there isn't. I will point out it's against the law in Birmingham to pick a brown leaf off a public park. They arrested a guy in Coughlin Park 2 years ago because he was collecting brown leaves to make charcoal briquettes. Viola own the leaves.
The composters?
The company that own all our landfills and waste tips, they segregate out and make corporate compost.
Well, nonetheless, it's quite useful stuff.
Yeah, Heidi's got a horse, so there's tons of that's the alternative.
I'll just quickly say one thing that reminded me about horse manure is, have any of you heard of this awful poison, aminopyralid? And I don't want to put you off using horse manure, but there's always a very slight risk it might have it in, and it's a weed killer made by Dow chemical, and few farms, not everyone, just a few, spray it on the grass they're growing to make hay because it kills the weeds they don't want, and then it's still in the grass. The horse eats the grass, goes through the horse's stomach, and it comes out in the poo and doesn't break down until it meets soil microbes. So it stays in the manure even 2, 3, 4 years, and then you spread it on your soil. It's still got weed killer in, which eventually breaks down maybe after a year, contact with soil microbes. Like I say, I don't want to put you off, but you can do a test for it. If you can get a bit of the manure you think you're getting hold of, plant a potato or a tomato or sow a broad bean or a pea or plant a runner bean, and if they grow healthily, because they're very susceptible if it was in there, if they grow healthily, you'll know within 2 or 3 weeks in more conditions that it's fine. So. Sorry, I didn't want to dampen your spirits.
If you were making your own mulch, what would you use?
Oh, when you say mulch, well, I would interpret that as compost, personally.
Okay.
Otherwise, were you thinking something else, or what?
No, see you saying mulch and compost, see if it's something different.
Isn't there a guy in America that's using bark chips?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, mulch is a very broad word, and yeah, it could be wood chips, for example. And wood chips would make a very successful mulch. I'd just be careful of that bit if I wanted to sow carrots, for example. It's quite difficult to sow carrots on a chippy surface. So it depends a bit what you want to do, but if you were going to just say plant potatoes, big vegetables starting from big seed or plant, winter squash, courgettes, they can go into quite a rough surface, and you see your options are broader. So, there's many ways of looking at that one.
What are your views on vertical planting?
Well, vertical planting, in theory, sounds great, doesn't it? You're kind of using all that extra space going up.
I was just reading a fascinating book by a guy called Michael Averman, he's running amazing urban farms in Vancouver. Great success in employing people with drug addictions and helping them to discover the meaning of life again. And he tried vertical planting and found it really difficult because they were growing strawberries in guttering and made little holes going up. He said, question of keeping moisture levels right in there, because the water keeps coming down, feeding plants in quite a small area. So vertical planting, yeah, has many possibilities, but technically it's quite difficult.
Now, if you look up Skygrow, Singapore, Skygrow in Singapore,
okay.
Amazing, absolutely.
Skygrow?
Skygrow, I think it's called.
Okay.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's a business venture, but it's
right, thank you.
That's hydroponic there, I think.
Plus, yeah, but it's vertical as well. It's rotating. Skygrow, I think it's called.
Hydroponics.
I was reading, it's not quite vertical planting, but I think it's one of Sarah Raven's books. She talks about growing squash plants, because I've got some and they go crazy and they cover them. You can't actually walk down the allotments if there's no space on the ground. But have you ever tried growing them or training them up something? She talks about training them in a wigwam.
Yeah, we're trying that this year with exactly a little wigwam. But do bear in mind that anything you're growing vertically, it still needs to root quite a long way. So it's not like it's only taking up that 1 square foot of space.
Yeah.
You know, it's feeding moisture and nutrients for quite a long way around.
What other crops in addition to squash can you keep through the winter? You mentioned squash keeping it dry through the winter. Are there any other crops you can keep for months and months and months?
Oh, for winter storage of vegetables? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, garlic is... Start with garlic. It's one of the easiest to grow. You harvest it late June, quite soon. We're coming up to garlic harvest now. And then keep it indoors. Garlic and onions store best in warm, dry conditions because they like dry, low humidity. And that will keep until following March or April. For example, potatoes, this variety Charlotte I mentioned, every year I plant it in the middle of April, harvest it mid-July. So it's in the ground for only 3 months. And it grows like a rocket in May. So now the plant's already really big. And because it's a second early potato, it's ready for harvest mid-July, usually and often before much blight is around, so you get nice clean tubers. I simply put them in a sack and keep them in the shed. It's a frost-free shed, so it's cool but not never frosty. And those Charlotte potatoes stay good to eat until as late as early April. So from a July harvest, you've got food for 8 to 9 months. Quite remarkable, I think.
I've still got Lady Belfour there.
Oh, right, okay, there you go.
That's bag of them.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, you mentioned the pesticide with the horse manure. Would there not be any worms? Because the horse manure that I have, sometimes when the worms manure, they're just full of worms. So wouldn't the worms die off because of the pesticide in the horse manure?
What I've noticed is where I had some experience of it myself, this was a horrible weed killer, there were worms in the manure.
Oh, there were still worms.
They seem to survive it. It only affects certain weeds.
Yeah. Do you have any specific kind of watering regimes for specific plants according to what their needs are?
Yeah, very much so actually. And it also depends on their stage of life. Like for example, I don't know if any of you have had problems getting basil and cucumber and melon plants going, and they're examples of seedlings that really do not like having wet feet. And you will have much nicer basil, cucumber and melon plants if you keep them a little bit on the dry side. Complete opposite, say, to lettuce and spinach. So it does help to know a few things like that. And in terms of watering, once plants are established and growing, partly it's your choice about what kind of food you like to eat. You know, if you water a bit less, your leaves, roots and fruits will be sweeter. If you water more, you'll get more abundant harvest, slightly more watery produce. So it's your call a bit. And then there's other things about watering. I mean, watering is a whole big subject really, but it's often said, for whatever reason, that you should water in the evening, less loss of water to evaporation. Personally, I prefer to water in the morning, because in Britain, going back to slugs, if
if you water in the evening, you leave the soil and you leave damp overnight. The slugs love that. Whereas if you water in the morning, you've got dry conditions by evening and you'll get less slug problems. You also get less mildew on leaves, which is another issue. And because you have a drier soil surface for longer, you have less weeds germinating. So on the whole, I recommend watering in the morning. But whenever you water, give soil a good soak, or plugs, or whatever it might be, not just a scattering on the surface. And if you're not sure, have a little look with a trowel after watering. Sometimes it's surprising, you know. I find it myself. I give it sort of it's a good soak. Soil was dry before. And I look, oh blimey, it's still really dry underneath. The soil that's got really dry needs quite a lot of water to really rot it again. But it's worth doing it for longer, but less often.
Have you tried growing avocados?
Avocados. Not in Britain. Well, yeah, I tried the usual thing. I'm trying to get a little seedling. But yeah, I don't want to discourage you, but I mean, on the whole, you can waste a lot of time really growing things. Basically, that's something that's not at home here. Tamarind is something my partner was trying. You know, things you
Oh, we've got all these sort of avocados which have been growing up in the 90s, where the weather is quite severe. As well as being
not
hot in the
avocados,
summer. But and they're beautiful.
the what's it?
They're beautiful fruit, but the weather is very severe, a lot more severe than it is.
No, avocados do not like frost, for example. So you just lose them every winter.
It's in Spain. Yeah, well, I mean, it was...
Yeah. They also need a high level of warmth to make their fruit. You know, it's not only about surviving. There's a big difference between plants that survive and plants that thrive. For example, even winter salads, which are very hardy plants, if you got them outside in your garden in most British winters, yeah, they'll survive. They won't give you many harvests until it warms up a bit from about, say, the middle of March. So, you know, there's all these things to consider. Yeah.
You didn't mention sorry. This lady.
Potatoes. Do you earth up your potatoes? My neighbours were appalled when I did the tree potato thing. Just planted them and you could do that, you've got to work the heart and everything.
Yeah. Well,
Gardener's question time last week. 4 people, panellists, all disagreed with each other.
oh, really? I'm really pleased to hear that, actually.
What do you do, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the thing about earthing potatoes is basically to give them something loose that the tubers can develop in. It's not about the plant rooting into the earthed up soil. It's just for tubers to develop and not have to sort of push up out of hard soil and go green when they're exposed to light. So you can do exactly the same thing with compost. Basically, that's what I do. I'll either put a bit of the surface compost around the plant, composting up if you like, or I'll drop a shovel full of compost on top of the plant. And the main reason for earthing up is, like I say, is to keep better tubering up, but keeping the light off the tubers.
In fact, I'm pretty sure all of the people here would be concerned about spraying. How do you get on with your farming and growing without the use of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides and so on to get a healthy crop?
Oh, really well, actually. That's the least of my problems. I mean, like I mentioned that one spray I use, which is this Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a soil bacterium. You know, that's a really interesting question because it does raise the whole issue of why organic farming is often so criticised in the media. Because you've got these chemical farmers who denuded their soil of life by using fertilisers, for example, synthetic fertilisers, and they will say, we couldn't possibly grow anything without weed killers and pesticides because our crops would just shrivel and go yellow and be attacked by pests. While they're completely ignoring the fact that they've run down their soil of life and fertility. So the kind of things I've been talking to you about this evening is about doing the exact opposite, building up your soil, building up life's fertility and health in the soil. And then you don't need to worry about these things and you can say goodbye to Monsanto and just get on with growing really strong, healthy plants.
Do you rotate, you know the audience?
Rotation?
Do you rotate
yeah.
crops? Because there's some crops that shouldn't have manure on How do you
They say.
It's in the code.
Where did you get this idea from?
Well, the traditional rotation is put
As it's described
compost on,
sometimes,
yes.
yeah. I don't agree with that one. Basically, vegetables are Olympic athletes of the plant world. They're the hardest plants to grow in general, much harder than growing ornamental plants. On one of my day courses, I had a very famous ornamental gardener come along, Penny Hoggers, who's written loads of books on growing flower gardens, ornamental gardening. In her 80th year, she decided to try growing vegetables. And she came along in February, and then she came back in August and said, "Do you know what, Charles?" I said, "This is really difficult. I'm going back to growing flowers." Wow, actually, that was a fantastic validation of, and it's why I think the RHS are much more interested in flowers. It's a lot easier. They're not really embracing this difficult issue, and rotation is one of them that comes into it and muddies the water, really, because, as you have said, it is that some plants don't like rich soil or whatever it might be. Actually, basically, they all just grow stronger and better, I find. So basically, my approach is to compost mulch all my ground every year, feed the stock, very simple, and then sow and plant whatever accordingly. And I'm not doing a 4-year rotation, that's way too complicated, and it's not practical. Most of us do not want to eat a quarter of this and a quarter of that. Grow what you want to eat, that's the starting point, and then work out, for want of a better word, rotation, but it needn't be as organised as that. Sometimes, it's quite good to have a little gap between growing things that might accumulate pest and disease otherwise. Some plants don't need it, actually. I'm sure some of you will know people have grown runner beans in the same place for 20 years. Fine. So.
I think people can get on without animal manure with decent compost. Some people don't want to use them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, obviously, homemade compost, for example. But I did mention, I do think we should be using our own.
Andy was saying about somebody who was arrested for getting leaves. When
Right.
I was doing a course years ago gardening, the guy took us out into some woodland, just in a rural, Birmingham park. Went into a bit of woodland. This is called moor. This is where the leaves fall. It's all rotted. Get this. Put this in your hanging basket. Put it in your compost mix. It's amazing. It's like deep mold that's already made for you.
But I do think, though, just be careful not to get too hung up on these kind of rules thing. That's, I'm not using any animal manures. Well, what about if a bird flies over and drops its poo? So sometimes, little bits of things are really good.
So do you top it up at what time do you sort of compost?
Well, I found a really, really suitable time, late autumn. So you're often clearing grain, harvesting nuts, salads, carrots, beetroot, whatever it might be. Ground becomes bare, pull out any weeds, pop on some compost. That's what I do.
What is this, December time?
Yeah, between late October and January, I think.
Right.
And that's great because then your compost mulch is protecting soil over the winter. It's been broken down by frost. You can run a rake or hoe through it lightly in early spring. Off you go. It's ready.
So you don't worry about the pH at all?
Sorry, who's asking?
Yeah. You don't worry about pH at all, do you?
Yeah, I tend not to actually. Yeah. Again, like a lot of things, I'm not saying it's not it's an invalid thing to do, but mostly I think people worry about it unnecessarily. Yeah.
Have you built up your own seed bank now, so you never need to buy any seeds?
No, sadly. Well, look, raising seed is a complicated matter, and for a lot of vegetables, you can't just do it for one plant. I've tried that. Say you've got a really nice red frills mustard, one of my favourite salad mustards. I kept one plant and kept the seeds from it, let it flower, sow the seed, very weak plants. And then I realised you need up to 10 or 12 to cross-pollinate gene bank. And for that you need a huge amount of space. So, sometimes these things are not always practical, but just to get you started, if you want to try peas, you just need one good pea plant. It doesn't need cross-pollination, just let them ripen on the plant, keep a few seeds. You've got brilliant seed that will do, I reckon, much better than what you buy. It's probably overseed. Lettuce, same, let them flower, keep your own seed.
Any companion planting?
Yeah, companion planting is good, but don't be under any illusions that it's going to solve any sort of potential pest problems. But having said that, it
can be very helpful. Like we do French marigolds with tomatoes. They complement each other very well in growth habit, don't interfere. They look really nice. Often things that look nice together is a good companion planting. Also things that taste good together. So, tomato and basil, garlic and parsley. You know, if you've got good taste combinations, they're probably going to grow well. Onions and carrots. You can work out a few of your own. I like to dot a few flowers around the garden because I think that it just generally must enhance the pest predator balance and you know, just lift the energy in the garden. And again, if you think it looks nice, flower, California poppies I love, they do sell secret annoyingly. But if you make your plot look really nice, that's going to get you out there more. And the whole thing's going to buzz with energy, which can only be good. Question right at the back.
Yeah, where do you source your water from when it's dry?
Water?
Yeah.
I'm using mostly tap water actually because I've got my rain butts, the weather like we've had recently, run out and I don't have enough. But that's mostly for undercover growing, polytunnel greenhouse and salad beds outside. I'm not watering most vegetables, I'm not watering, but mostly the salads and celery. Gardening Witch did a trial comparing watering pot plants with tap water and rainwater, and found that on average over different sites over the country, the plants watered with tap water grew stronger. And they think it was to do, I'm not saying tap water is all good, but it's just maybe not quite as bad as it's sometimes made out to be.
Is the chlorine in tap water a problem with biodynamic growing?
Probably. Yeah. I don't know for sure, to be honest.
Yeah, it kills bacteria, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Water's terrible.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there you go. There's a lot to be said about that one.
Have you found like an issue with watering with rainwater on seedlings with the damping off?
Yeah, I think that there have been issues reported with that, and I think some problem can be if your water butts get filthy, dirty. Sometimes if you notice, if you don't clean out your butts, say at least once a year, preferably more than that, they start getting smelly. And so it's worth cleaning out your water butts, and otherwise they can build up organisms that don't help seedlings. But otherwise it's fine. One more question? I've got to finish soon, I'm afraid.
Is it worth making your own plant food for, say, comfrey and horsetail and all that, to soak into buckets?
Very much so, yeah. If you've got time to do it, you know, that's always, I would say, the main consideration. If you've got time to do these things, almost everything is worthwhile, really. And if you feel good about something, also, give it a try. You know, you can try it once, maybe it won't work for you. Don't listen too much to all the they-says out there. You know, follow your hunches as well. You know, reason with yourself. Someone says that, but why should that be so? Maybe it's not so. You know, do your own investigations. And I'll just sign off on that note, because I really hope that this evening I've fired up your imaginations a bit and given you some enthusiasm and just desire to get out there and get on with it. Right.
As I said, I'm honoured to meet the man and